Good morning. Morning. So now that we've been through some of the intros to the Gospels, I want to teach one last week on a Gospel topic, and then Larry will teach the next couple of weeks. And I think this topic will increase our confidence that the Gospels are full of eyewitness testimony. What are the sources that the Gospel authors used? All right. A little trouble here. Yeah, I'm actually going to rearrange those two laptops so that receiver doesn't have a great big CD duplicator right in front of it that we don't use anymore anyway. So where did the gospel writers get their information? Well, we saw in our intros that Matthew and John were apostles who were eyewitnesses themselves, right, to a lot of the events that they recorded. And we saw that Mark recorded the preaching of Peter at Rome, and Peter was an eyewitness. And then we saw that Luke interviewed eyewitnesses, and we went through all the evidence and when he did that, when Paul was under arrest for 2 years in front of Felix. But what about stories in the Gospels that look like you wouldn't expect any Christian disciple to be present? Where do those stories come from? And that's what we'll take a look at today. So, for example, there are stories that talk about what went on inside meetings of the Sanhedrin. The first example we have here of a Sanhedrin story it's the Council of Jewish Elders. So a Council of Jewish Elders isn't going to have Jesus' followers present, you would think. So how do we know what they're saying? Well, the first thing that happens is, after the raising of Lazarus, they have a meeting. They're so concerned about everyone following after that it says the priests and the Pharisees convened the Sanhedrin and said, what are we going to do since this man does many signs? If we let him continue in this way, everyone will believe in him. Then the Romans will come and remove both our place and our nation. One of them, Caiaphas, who was high priest that year, said to them, you know nothing at all. You're not considering that it's to your advantage that one man should die for the people, rather than the whole nation perish. Well, how do we know what Caiaphas is saying in front of the Sanhedrin? Well, that's not the only Sanhedrin story. The next Sanhedrin story, of course, is when Jesus is on trial, and part of his trial took place before the Sanhedrin. And we have the words that are spoken back and forth with Jesus, but it doesn't say any of his apostles were in there with him. So where did they get his words? And then it continues on even into the book of Acts when Peter and John have healed a lame man, they're called before the Sanhedrin. And it even says that at one point the Sanhedrin ordered them out of the room. And after they had left the room, they conferred among themselves, and then here's what they said. Well, how's any author like Luke of the Gospel of Acts going to get the inside info on what they said after the apostles had left the room? Now, the next example, some of the apostles were freed from jail by an angel. And in Acts chapter 5, it says, after they had called them to testify before the Sanhedrin became enraged. It says, when they heard this, they were enraged and wanted to kill them. But a Pharisee named Gamaliel, a teacher of the law, who was respected by all the people, stood up in the Sanhedrin and ordered the men to be taken outside for a little while. And then after they were taken outside, it records that Gamaliel said, you know, if this is not from God, it's going to fizzle out on its own, just like all these other little uprisings and leaders and false messiahs and so on. But if it's from God, you don't want to be opposed to it. So just let them go and we'll see what happens. How do we know? Who's in there recording this? How do we know what's being said in front of the Sanhedrin? So you have to ask, do we have inside info somehow? Was there a Sanhedrin elder who was sympathetic to the Christians who would actually provide this information? And the answer is yes. Mark records after Jesus died, Joseph of Arimathea, a prominent member of the Sanhedrin, who was himself looking forward to the kingdom of God, came and boldly went in to Pilate and asked for Jesus' body. Now the phrase, looking forward to the kingdom of God, just means he has the messianic expectation that all of the Jews have. Doesn't mean he's a Christian. So is there any evidence that he becomes a Christian? Well, look at John's recounting of the same incident. After this, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a disciple of Jesus, but secretly, because of his fear of the Jews, asked Pilate for the body. So in fact, yes, we do have an inside source who no doubt came out into the open as a Christian after the resurrection, or sometime after the resurrection. Don't know when. But he would be a source of first-hand information for gospel authors, including Luke when writing in Acts. And it's kind of interesting. Joseph of Arimathea doesn't come across too perfectly, does he? He's prominent, and he doesn't want to lose that prominence. He doesn't want to lose his position. He doesn't want to openly come out as a follower of Jesus at this point. But God is able to use him to help the gospel authors because of it. You might say, God can use even people's weaknesses. The fact that he was a little bit weak and afraid and didn't want to speak up made him an inside source for gospel authors. He would have been booted out of the Sanhedrin if he had openly come out as a disciple of Jesus. And then we wouldn't have his testimony. But because things happened the way they did, he is the obvious source for these stories. But it's not just Sanhedrin stories where this happens. We have stories where we seem to know what the priests in the temple are saying when they meet together. How do we get that? Let's take a look. We find them conspiring together to arrest Jesus in Matthew 26. And then we find them conspiring later in the same chapter with Judas Iscariot, and we have the words that they're speaking. And then when Judas Iscariot regrets what he has done and he comes back, he says, this man is innocent. I don't want to do this anymore. And they say, that's your problem, not ours. And he flings the 30 pieces of silver back at them and goes out and immediately kills himself, which means he doesn't have time, Judas doesn't have time to be a source for any gospel author. He had no more contact with the apostles. He went out to his death. So how do we know what priests are saying in a meeting like these? Do we get inside info? Who would reveal their secret conversations, their private conversations? We have an interesting little phrase here in Acts chapter 6. So the preaching about God flourished. The number of the disciples in Jerusalem multiplied greatly, and a large group of priests became obedient to the faith. So yeah, we do have an inside source, more than one, and that's actually important that there's a large group of priests who became obedient to the faith, because priests rotate through their priestly duties. They go back home to the Levite lands outside of various towns. They don't stay 365 days at the temple. There are teams of priests and Levites who rotate through. And so when it says a large group of priests, that would tend to imply that there were probably priests at any time of the year who had become Christians, who could be sources for what happened. Did they remain priests, or did they become open and then get booted out of the priesthood? I'm not sure. But the stories that we need end really in the Gospels anyway. So they were there long enough as priests who were perhaps secret followers of Christ to observe these stories, like the Judas Iscariot stories, for example, and to come relay them later to the church when they became open Christians. So this is, all of these stories, a skeptic might hear the story of Judas going before the priests and then going back, and the skeptic might say, great story, where does it come from? How do you get this information? But there is an explanation. Another example, Herod Antipas. We have some stories that seem to have inside info from the palace of Herod Antipas. For example, he was a ruler up in the north, the regions of Galilee and Perea, which is on the east side of the Jordan, during the time of the ministry of Jesus. Now we have this lengthy story in Matthew chapter 14 that comes straight out of his palace, one that we're very familiar with. Lots and lots of details here. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch, that's Herod Antipas in Roman historians, at that time Herod the Tetrarch heard the report about Jesus. This is John the Baptist, he told his servants. So we're hearing what he said to his servants somehow. He has been raised from the dead, and that's why supernatural powers are at work in him. And now Matthew does a flashback, because John the Baptist is already dead. And so now he's going to do a flashback and tell about John the Baptist being executed. For Herod had arrested John, chained him, and put him in prison on account of Herodias, his brother Philip's wife. Since John had been telling him, it's not lawful for you to have her. Though he wanted to kill him, he feared the crowd, since they regarded him as a prophet. But when Herod's birthday celebration came, Herodias' daughter danced before them and pleased Herod. So he promised with an oath to give her whatever she might ask. And prompted by her mother, she answered, give me John the Baptist's head here on a platter. Although the king regretted it, he commanded that it be granted because of his oaths and his guests. So he sent orders and had John beheaded in the prison. His head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, who carried it to her mother. Then his disciples came, removed the corpse, buried it, and went and reported to Jesus. Look at how many details over a period of time. First of all, we have the background of why he's angry with John the Baptist and what's being said. Then we have his desire expressed. He wanted to kill him, but he feared the crowd. So who knows this? Inside info. And then we have all these details at his birthday feast of what was said and done. You don't think that Christians are invited to Herod Antipas's birthday feast, right? So, once again, a skeptic would say, that's a great story. Where does it come from? How would a gospel author know this story? Late in Jesus' life, when Herod was visiting and Pontius Pilate heard that Herod was visiting, and Pontius Pilate was kind of trying to pass the buck a little bit on sentencing Jesus, he called Herod in. And it said Herod came because for a long time he had wanted to meet Jesus. So once again, this is kind of private information. Who has he been, when he's in his palace and he voices a desire to meet Jesus, who is there to hear it and report it to a gospel author? Do we have some kind of inside info? Well, we have an interesting little passage here in Luke. We're familiar with this passage because Luke records that there were some affluent women who supported this traveling ministry of Jesus. The 12 were with him, and also some women who had been healed of evil spirits and sicknesses. Mary, called Magdalene, 7 demons had come out of her. Joanna, the wife of Chuza, Herod's steward. Susanna, and many others who were supporting them from their possessions. So Herod's steward would be the kind of servant who's always at the king's side. In those days, he might even be forced to do the food tasting to make sure it's not poisoned. He can drop dead, not Herod, if the food's been poisoned. And he would actually be there hearing things. And his wife was a devout follower of Jesus who was helping to finance the ministry and who did some following him around in Galilee. And we saw when we studied the intro to Luke, that Luke tends to name the people that he interviewed personally and then not name the others. For example, on the road to Emmaus, after the resurrection, Jesus appeared to 2 disciples. And we mentioned that Luke says Clopas and the other man. And following Luke's pattern, that probably means Luke interviewed Clopas when he was putting together the gospel, and he didn't interview the other man, so he doesn't get named. So what do you get from this passage? Some women are named, and then it says, and many others. Well, and many others are the ones that Luke didn't interview, and so he doesn't name them. But the ones he named were people that Luke no doubt talked to directly to get stories. And one of them is the wife of the steward who lives with her husband in the palace of Herod, and whose husband is right there at Herod Antipas's side all the time. And so, how do you get these great stories from places like Herod Antipas's palace? Well, actually, there's a very good explanation, it turns out. Now, you might say that the early church kind of had a network of information. The early church had followers that reached into the Sanhedrin, the council of elders who judged matters in Jerusalem, the priests in the temple who also go out into the land, into all corners of the land when they're not in the temple and then come back. And even the Roman government, the Galilean government in particular, during his ministry. And this network kept on growing during Paul's journeys. We see the famous story of the centurion, the Roman centurion Cornelius, who had a vision that caused him to send for Peter, and Peter had the vision on the rooftop telling him, do not call anything unclean that God has blessed. The beginning of the preaching of the gospel to Gentiles. Then we have in Philippians, late in Paul's life when he is imprisoned in Rome, there's a couple of interesting references that he makes in Philippians to those who are converting. In chapter 1, verse 13, Paul says, beginning in verse 12, now I want you to know, brothers, that what has happened to me has actually resulted in the advancement of the gospel, so that it has become known throughout the whole imperial guard and to everyone else that my imprisonment is for Christ. And then when he gets to the end of Philippians, when he's giving his final salutations to people, he says, starting in verse 21, greet every saint in Christ Jesus. Those brothers who are with me greet you. All the saints greet you, but especially those from Caesar's household. Soldiers and servants in Caesar's household are becoming converted by Paul during all this time that he spends in Rome under house arrest. They assign servants to stand near him and guard him, and he's converting some of them. And servants who come back and forth from Caesar's household to his house arrest location are being converted. And so this network from which you can get information keeps growing throughout the early days. It's not strictly a gospel source. I just threw that in, free of charge, by the way. But I think it's inspiring to know that if you look at the pattern of who Luke interviewed, who he names, if you look at the eyewitness testimony that we get from Matthew and Peter, underlying the Gospel of Mark and John, every time you think, now wait a minute, how would they know this? How do you know what the priests are saying in private? How do you know what Sanhedrin's saying? Actually, there's a very direct explanation for all of it. And so we have confidence that these Gospels are truly eyewitness testimony that was faithfully recorded for us. Do you have any questions? We'll just end early there. I appreciate your time and attention. And like I said, Larry will teach the next couple of weeks. Looking forward to that. Thank you.